Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's edition of Tales from Outer Space, where I take stories from across the internet and read them for your entertainment. This particular story is called Bridge Species, written by Deathworld. And that, class, concluded the professor, is why humanity is the most peaceful, reasonable, cooperative, and overall docile species in all the universe. Any questions? Susan, the only human in the class, raised her hand, attracted by the sudden movement, the eyes of all the predator species fixated on their raised appendage. At first, that had scared her a little, but she'd gotten used to it, though the shark-like Corbian's tendency to rattle his teeth did still make her wince. Professor Sci-fi was no exception to the rule, and his beady gaze snapped to her palm and then to her face. He tilted his beak towards her, giving her permission to speak. Susan did her best to keep her voice level. Professor, don't you think that's overstating the role of humanity in brokering the ceasefire? Goob, the aforementioned Corbian, slowly clicked his teeth in the equivalent of a sigh. Susan would buy him a fermented fish drink later as an apology, but she was frankly tired of keeping her mouth shut. She had ranted to him all week, and now she had finally hit her breaking point. No, Professor Sci-fi raised a single feather in the crest. Why would you say that, Susan Patel? You're mythologizing an entire species, though humanity did play an important part in bringing the herbivorous Martians and the carnivorous Fe'ens to metaphorical table. It also took the work of tireless Martian and Fe'en diplomats to bring peace into action. Another feather curled up on his cheek. Susan wasn't prone to violence, but she wanted to tear that smug look off his crest. She couldn't stand carnivore supremacists. Susan Patel, I need you to elaborate. Sci-fi always used the Fe'en naming conventions for all his students, even if they didn't like it, which Susan didn't. Why are you deflecting credit? Are you implying that the narrative of humans as a bridge species is incorrect? Why, I was under the assumption that humanity had the best features of carnivores and herbivores. In fact, many Fe'en texts put the entire onus on humanity for bringing the panicky, fickle Martians to the table. At this point, the sarcasm was getting ridiculous. Susan ignored the murmurs around her and doggedly pushed forward. Considering they were almost the 20-year anniversary of the treaty, I think it's unfair to describe the Martians as panicky or fickle. Another handful of feathers curled up. It seems clear that the treaty's longevity is due to humanity's wisdom in guiding the Martians, Dr. L'Annie's people. Her writing is clearly biased against Martians, and you note, instead of accepting the inherent sapience and rationality of a herbivorous species, and bigots like her, put all of it on a slightly more palatable omnivores. Susan Patel, there'll be no shouting in my classroom. Sci-fi didn't raise his voice, but he whistled sharply for emphasis. Susan realized she was actually yelling. She leaned back in her chair, glanced guiltily at her cringing herbivorous classmates, and took a deep breath. Sorry, Professor, but my point still stands. Prove to me with textual evidence, and I might consider it. Now, that was a blatant lie. Anytime Susan wrote a paper that didn't support Sci-fi's beliefs, he never gave her more than 70%. The professor wrapped up the class as Susan fumed in her chair. Finally, when it was time to go, she shoved her stuff into her bag with more force than necessary. Goob gave her a sympathetic pat on the shoulder with his thin tentacle. Ignore old Sci-fi, he said, keeping his rumbling voice soft. He'll never change his mind. Anyway, want to get drinks tonight? Our most cooperative and docile friend. We can get those kibis you like so much. And they sell plant ones for me, too. Susan laughed. They're called kebabs, Gorb. She waved her mutual friend, a fuzzy Martian named Omi, who had slunk in late and taken a seat on the other side of the lecture hall. Actually, she said as her friend turned to hurry to join them, I think I'm in the mood for a salad. They ended up getting both kebabs and salads. Gorb, of course, had bought 6 kebabs, while Omi was wolfing down her enormous bowl of sunflower arugula salad, and Susan had a reasonable portion of each. They were sitting together at an open-air, for a station at least, table, surrounded by aliens of every stripe. It was a species nightmare. The reminder made her mood sour. Sometimes I want to punch Sci-fi in the face, said Susan, tearing off a chunk of seasoned meat with an exaggerated ferocity. Goob wiggled his dorsal fin in agreement. He might finally listen to you, then. Violence is the only universal language. I thought that it was math, Omi said, her voice soft and amused. Violent bath, that's the most universal of languages, Gorb rumbled with a faux wisdom. Susan snorted. I'll deck him with the calculator, then. Omi looked at her with wide, liquid black eyes that invited comparison to deer and other innocent terrestrial mammals. As someone who was diametrically opposed to innocence, Omi, nonetheless, used her big eyes to convince suckers that she couldn't hurt a fly. You can't be unreasonable, Susan. You're human, yeah. And you're supposed to be a mindless herd following, and that clearly failed. Primly, Omi muttered, I haven't had an independent thought in my life. Gorb rattled his teeth in an awkward laugh. It was no secret that the Galactic Society favored predatory species over herbivorous ones, and he was always a little uncomfortable about that reminder. Humans, being one of the few true sapient omnivores, occupied an odd place in wider society. Their refusal to be lumped into either category was a distinct reminder that those categories were in truth artificial and not immutable. It was just so frustrating to run into people who thought that arbitrary facts of biology determined everything about one entire species. Susan sighed. I wish there was a way to teach Iffy a lesson. His analysis of the Machin and war was stupid and illogical, and he keeps bringing up the 20-year anniversary as an excuse to spout specious drivel. He says something shitty one more time, and I can't guarantee his safety. The assault is illegal, even if he deserves it, said Omi mildly. I'm not actually going to punch him. Gorb cough-growled deep in his throat. So what are you going to do? Drag him in front of the treaty makers of the Ashen and ceasefire, so they can yell about how wrong he is? Susan made a thoughtful sign and stared intently at her salad. Gorb clicked back. I'm not even going to ask. Susan was one of the few humans on the Lele-N spaceport, located firmly in N space. The station was over a month away from the closest human majority settlement. It was an auxiliary human diplomatic mission consisting of 12 humans and a handful of non-humans, 2 others who were here as students, and 3 contract workers who would be on station for a few more months. It was no exaggeration to say that Susan knew every other human on the station. The expat community was small enough that they had a single group chat, and they could all meet in one restaurant with a room left over. Thanks to the high proportion of diplomats to regular people, plus Susan's actual interest in politics, considering her major, she got a fair amount of gossip about the current state of international politics. It wasn't the best infosec, but things were less strict in a backwater posting. At the next monthly human meetup, Susan looked around at the bar for her target. Most people were clumped in groups of 3 or 4. Kimiko, a smooth-talking diplomat, was attempting to drag a taciturn Michael into a conversation, while George was badly flirting with Sanders. The man she was looking for, however, liked to spend the first hour getting very drunk. Susan saw him returning from the bar with a glass of whiskey and made a beeline to him. Ali was a short, friendly man who was the resident human science liaison on the station. He was also the easiest to wheedle gossip out of. She gave him her best friendly smile. So, Ali, how's it going? What is this time? He said immediately. Nothing. At his glare, Susan admitted. Well, now that you mention it, any news on that UHN ship that you mentioned last month? Ali's suspicion increased as he sipped his whiskey. It's supposed to be for refuel. Why? Does it have anything to do with the Ashen and ceasefire celebration? Why? Repeated Ali, dramatically more hesitant, thus confirming that Susan was on the right track. Oh, come on. Why else would someone stop at a tin can like this? It's heading to the Feck capital, right? It wasn't that hard of a leap, and the Lele-N spaceport was equidistant between the Feck homeworld and the United Human Nation territories. With the anniversary approaching, no doubt the UHN wanted to send people for the inevitable pomp and circumstance. Ali made a show of grumbling, which meant that he was about to cave in any second. Well, you're not. Am I interrupting something here? The smooth, deep voice of Chinaka Musa, head of the diplomatic mission, brought Ali to a stump before he could spill the beans. Consul Musa was easily the most terrifying human that Susan had ever met. Rumor had it that Chinaka had once been part of the elite UHN Black Ops and had chosen to retire to a peaceful backwater. She didn't help matters by constantly remarking how simple and quiet it was in the station. Susan deflated. I was just asking about the ship that's going to refuel here. Musa tapped the rim of a glass. The proper answer is that we can't comment on that. Right, Ali? Ali nodded frantically, almost spilling his whiskey. So, Susan, why are you so curious about the ship that might or might not be refueling here? Her dark eyes glittered as she pinned Susan with her gaze. In for a chip, in for a satellite. Susan took a deep breath and immediately spilled out her frustrations about the stupid bigoted professor who ran her theory of galactic conflict class. After ranting for much longer and louder than she needed, Susan finally ran out of steam. And that's why I was hoping to get into contact with someone who was a part of the ceasefire, to rub it into the professor's face, she finished. I thought that there might be someone on that ship. At some point, it had shifted from Susan explaining herself to Ani and Musa, to Susan expounding upon her university problems to the entirety of the human population of the station. Silence hung in the air for a few moments as everyone stared at Susan, but she'd lost all sense of self-consciousness ages ago in high school theater. Well, said Michael, one of the contractors who normally kept to himself, he sounds like an arsehole. This statement was met with a universal agreement. Musa nodded, looking thoughtful. That usually meant nothing good. Susan, I think I might be able to help you with your problem. Me too, said Kimiko. She nudged Michael, who sighed and gave a nod. Ani lifted the empty glass in the air, already a little drunk. Yeah! General agreement washed over the humans in the bar, plus the one or two aliens in the diplomatic mission, who were more than eager to serve some comeuppance. Susan grinned. This might be easier than she thought. The plan was set in motion with the combined forces of humanity, well, the station's humanity, but even the microcosm of society could wreak exceptional havoc. A complicated system of favors were exchanged and called in while Susan waited, jittery with anticipation. Her two friends immediately noticed the difference in her demeanor. She no longer bothered to raise her voice in class, speaking only when called on by the professor and giving the most bland, non-committal answers she could manage. I bought you a kebab, Gorpma rumbled, shoving a greasy bag in her hands. And fruit salad, Ami added, delicately placing a small container on top of the take-out box. Huh? Oh, thank you. I didn't have lunch yet, so this is great. Susan opened the bag, suddenly feeling her hunger. Omi herded her to a picnic table, while Grub followed after them, clicking anxiously. He'd been doing that a lot. Something had rattled him. Susan immediately felt guilty. She'd been so caught up in the project that she'd become a bad friend. She hadn't even asked Gorb about what was going on. Meanwhile, Gorb and Ami were still looking out for her, even buying her food while she was absent-mindedly ignoring them. Hey, what's wrong? Susan set the food on the table. That's your question? Gorb exchanged looks with Ami. What do you mean? Said Susan, knowing exactly what they meant, but giving a very unconvincing approximation of confusion. You don't talk in class. When you do talk, you say bland nothings instead of what you really feel. The professor praised you. I've just, been busy with the final project. Gorb snorted. You're never too busy to yell at injustice. That's what you said before. Did you change your mind? Susan winced, embarrassed that Gorb still remembered that drunken rant about never being a bystander. Well, don't let him get to you, Ami cried out, loudly. Susan stared at her. She'd never heard the mash and razor voice. I know that Professor Keifi is cruel and stupid, and he'll never change his mind, no matter what you say. But standing up for us, it means, I don't know how to say it. I can't stand up for myself. No mashing can. He hates us, and he's just looking for any excuse to kick us out of the class. And we can't let that happen. So we have to just sit there and take it. But you didn't have to stand up for us, but you did anyway. Even though he likes humans more than Mashins, and you could have just coasted on that. So, thank you. Both Gorb and Susan were staring at her, but Ami didn't try to make herself smaller like she usually did. Instead, she puffed out her chest and raised her ears high. So, what changed, Susan? Why are you so quiet now? Did you decide it wasn't worth it anymore? If you did, I understand. It's hard to be an enemy of authority. I get it, and I respect it. I just don't want to use this waste of life to kill your spark. Ami's 3 lungs were working overtime, rasping softly in silence. Susan, for once, was left without words. Oh, she tried again to summon something to say. It's, not that, Ami, I promise. Keifi is an arsehole, and I'm not going to give up. Susan considered what to do next. The plan in motion, if it worked, would mean more to Ami than to her. Ami and the other Mashins were here to exchange programs to foster peace between the historic enemies. They had to be on their best behavior. No insult could be answered, no mistake could be made. The Mashin students were representing their entire people to a species who still considered them inferior. And they were friends. Consul Musa would give her hell for this, but it was worth it. Remember how the professor gave us the option to do an oral presentation instead of a written report for our final? More specifically, Keifi had allowed them to do a 4-person traditional for N call and response, which was a time-honored art of his people. Almost nobody ever took him up on that offer, since the call and response epics were elaborate, non-linear, and long. It was far less work to write up an essay instead of attempting to create and perform a multi-person saga. But Keifi claimed that he rewarded creativity, so the option was there. Of course, his generosity didn't extend to mashing musical poetry, or informative Corbian sculptures, or classic human PowerPoint. Ami flicked her ears back in a nod equivalent, and Gorb grunted. "What's that got to do with anything?" he rumbled. Susan explained, and as she did, Ami became increasingly more excited, and Gorb slowly lowered his head to the table. "Let me help," Ami said brightly. "Of course." She glanced at Gorb. "I know I told you about what we're planning, but you don't have to—" "Oh, shut up and tell me what to do," he grumbled. "Great, so here's what we're doing next." With that, several more gears were being set in motion. The restrictions set upon Ami were just one side of a coin. Technically, being a representative for her people meant that she had contact with official representatives of her people. And Gorb was impossible to dislike, so he made use of his absurd number of friends, many who were in the journalism department just like him. Susan's bid to become a respectable student was successful, and Keifi approved her request to deliver the final in 4-person call and response. Susan lied and said that she planned on asking around classmates, but she hadn't got any takers. Of course, she hadn't asked a single other classmate. "If no one decides to work with me, sir," she asked, "would you let me work with people outside the class, even if they aren't students?" His crest twitched in a distinctly suspicious way. "Fine. You may use people who aren't my students, but I will grade you equally harshly no matter who it is. Furthermore, I expect the writing to be entirely your own." He paused, and the feathers rippled. Susan didn't know what that meant at first, but one look at his beady eyes enlightened her. Disdain, or more acutely, the desire to see her fail. "Susan Patel, you may wish to write an essay instead. Your people are less capable of art forms, and there is no shame in that." "I can put it off, I promise. Thank you, Professor. I won't let you down." She gave him a big smile, knowing full well that it usually made for ends uncomfortable. Keifi kept his feathers deliberately still to hide any irritation or lingering schadenfreude. "Yes, see that you don't." With that, he dismissed her. Susan nodded and left in a hurry. After all, she had one more email to send. This next one was for the history department head, who was dramatically more tolerant. And, just as importantly for the plan, always looking for ways to raise the profile of the school. And if she forgot to CC her professor onto the email, well, mistakes happen. The department head was more than happy to have 3 diplomats on their way to the capital come speak in the classroom. And if the mission heads for both the humans and Mashans wanted to show up, then even better. And of course, reporters could be invited to spread the word of the university's efforts to honoring peace. The department head went on to forward it to the colleague's dean, who was just as interested. Why, they could even make this an open event for other students to attend if they wished. Susan added Consul Musa to the email chain to confirm that this wasn't something that Susan was just making up, and Musa's professional email ramped up the enthusiasm of the college. Susan watched as more and more people were looped into the growing event, and then she belatedly forwarded the email chain back to Professor Keifi with an apology for not keeping him involved in the first place. As had she planned, he could do nothing but give his enthusiastic agreement. If the leader of his department and the dean and a dozen loosely associated individuals were for it, who was he to say no? UHNS Bima docked with the spaceport 2 weeks later, and the last piece slid into place. It was showtime. Susan rocked from side to side, unsure of what to do with all the anxious energy. She had intended to do something big, but somehow it had spiraled way beyond that. Instead of their small classroom, this was now taking place in one of the university's auditoriums. Susan took tally of the people who were already there. The dean, the department head, associated professors, students from various departments drawn by the promise of extra credit, the local mayor, the representatives of the Interstellar for N government, almost the entire human population, dozens of the UHNS Beamer's passengers, the consul, and the local Mashan mission. And that was all before the speakers had even arrived. And she was still being graded for this. In fact, Professor Keifi had pulled her aside after class to hiss a threat. He wouldn't adjust her grade even a single percentage point if she thus failed. In fact, he said, with a vindictive flare on his crest, he would show no mercy if she failed in front of an audience. Susan knew that she could appeal to her grade if he pulled any outlandish stunts, but that wouldn't save her if she screwed up. "Calm down," Ami murmured to her before she could spiral too far into her anxiety. You prepared for this. You got this. Gorb patted her on the shoulder with his thin tentacle. The sequins on her long sleeves made soft scratching noises against the pseudo scales. After this, we celebrate. Yeah, said Susan, taking in a deep breath. She started muttering the Gettysburg Address under her breath, an old warm-up that she'd picked up in theatre class and still used to this day. It was either that or vocalizing gibberish, and she did not need it to look more crazy than she was. Omi picked up on the pamphlets and started flipping through it as Susan muttered beside her. The pamphlets were for the people who were unfamiliar with the call and response. It had a blurb about the event and listed the cues for the audience participation. Susan had already memorized each cue. Hell, at this point, she knew more about and call and response than any human art form. Gorb's continued patting became urgent shaking. Look, they're here. Everyone else noticed at the same time as Gorb, and the audience started to grow quiet. Susan put on a smile and went over the 3 people who had miraculously agreed to be part of the spite-fueled final project. The 4 of them took their place on the stage while the dean gave her speech about the importance of unity and introduced their honored guests. And now, said the dean, we present to you Bridge Species, written and spoken by Susan Patel. As a speaker, Susan stood in the center, and the voices stood around her. On the left stood Rami, one of the catalysts in the initial ceasefire and the current diplomat to Earth principle. She was taller than most of her species, though stooping over with age, and she had a brilliant green feathers common to females. To Susan's left was Dr. Ipper, an elderly Martian professor who, after a stint as a prisoner of war, became an unlikely driver of peace. Ipper's fur was a pale patch brown, as was typical for those who had 300. Standing directly in front of Susan, taking the place of the last voice, was Commander Leslie Heinrich Jimenez, a special ops soldier who was the long-time good friend of both Ra'ami and Ipper. All 3 of them had talked extensively about their experience, and Ra'ami had even written a call-to-response epics of her own about the war. After Susan had reached out to her, she had helped polish up the version that was submitted to the professor. Epics, however, were performed live, and it was equally traditional to change things for the actual performance. The beauty, after all, came from the flow. Susan took a deep breath. There were about 300 people here, which was the biggest crowd she'd ever performed in front of. The high school theatre classes had absolutely nothing on this, and the blinking green light in the camera reminded her that this was going to be live-streamed. Susan resisted the urge to adjust the mic on her lapel. She couldn't do this. She was going to freak out and everything would fall apart, and it would be her fault. She caught Omi's gaze in the front row, and her friend gave her an encouraging nod. Next to her, Gorb waved a fin tentacle wildly, but neither of them broke her out of her increasing panic. Instead, it was the hostile gaze of Professor Kaifi that reminded her of why she'd gone through so much effort. Susan took another deep breath. She could do this. She could do this. She would fucking do this and rub the results in this asshole's face. The dean finished her introductions, and Susan soaked in the anticipatory applause. This was her cue, and this was going to be her victory. Susan projected her voice, staring straight into the crowd. Who speaks here? I speak here, said the Feck diplomat. Her voice was high and clear. I speak here, echoed the Martian professor, warm and surprisingly loud. And last, rounding it out, was the gravelly tones of the human soldier. I speak here. Susan spread out her arms wide. If she were a Feck, then the feathers on her wings would have flared, changing colors and signifying that she was now addressing the audience. Susan made do with long, draping sleeves and sequins that shifted from green to blue, black in the electric lights. Who listens here? The response was delayed at first. We listen here, speaker, said the crowd, scattered. But the second line was thunderous. Oh, voices, we listen here. We listen here, Susan lowered her arms. What story do we tell? She asked. Speaker, we know, the 3 voices repeated, perfectly synchronized. And so Susan spoke. We start with the end, and we start with the beginning. This is how the war ends. The war ends with a Feck whose wings are covered in blood, a Martian who demands mercy for his captor, and a human who bears witness. The war ends in the shame and suffering of those living, in the silence and stillness of those dead. The war ends when a promise is made. She raised her arms. We start with the end, and we start with the beginning, answered the 200 voices, filling the air like thunder. This is how the war begins. The war begins with a planet that shines like a jewel, home to a people who cared little for leaving its embrace, and desired by a people who could not help but dream for more polished gems to decorate their crest. The war begins with the destruction of a ship in chlorophyll green skies. The war begins with a lie. Ra'ami had grown her flight feathers in a home of soft winds and white clouds. She had 3 mothers and 4 fathers and 5 siblings, all with sharp beaks, and she learned how to argue before she learned how to talk. Ra'ami could pick apart a phrase in such a way that the speaker would disagree with their own judgment. And yet, there were certain beliefs that Ra'ami had never turned this critical gaze to. In fact, there were a great deal of truths that Ra'ami did not see, because she had deliberately made herself blind. "What did you not see?" Susan asked. "1,000 growing lies," Ra'ami answered. "But the biggest lie is that of superiority. We told ourselves that we were better. Are my people special? Yes, in the same fundamental way that every society and species is unique. But better? No." But the lies had cradled her since hatching, and Ra'ami was no different from the rest of her generation. Her destiny was to expand the wings of the Fe'en Republic, to bring peace and wealth to the worlds under its shadow. The Republic turned their sight to the Masha system, resource-rich and occupied by a plant-eating species that had little interest in settling outside their star. The Fe'en, on their other hand, were predators, capable of higher level of thought and planning than the little herbivores that mismanaged their beautiful worlds. Or so it was claimed. The people of Masha were not kind before the war. Dr. Ippa was old enough to remember this time, and he remembered the enmities between tribe and caste and creed, both across the nations and inside them. But there was an ease in the discord, the kind of gentle manners that came with the kind of power struggles that ultimately meant nothing. The Fe'en Republic saw this conflict and crept in with their claws extended. It was trivial for them to widen the divisions between the different groups, playing one side against the other. The Mashans noticed, of course, but nobody saw it yet as a danger. "Our songs were sharp," Dr. Ippa said. "We knew we were being led towards a waiting war, but we were equally arrogant. We thought that we could play the Fe'en for resources, just as they played us." Had the Fe'en been more patient, then they likely would have won. But they were also guilty of hubris. More than that, they were victims of their own propaganda machine. Every day they claimed that the pathetic, traitorous Mashans were simultaneously plotting the downfall of the Republic while being incompatible with creating a functioning society. It was a surprise to the Mashans when the Fe'en Republic seized the opportunity for war. They had not understood the depths of the Fe'en's disdain. Susan raised her arms. "How did the war begin?" "The war begins with a lie." The audience shouted back. Well, most of the audience. Susan noticed that Professor Kaifi stayed silent. "The war begins with the destruction of Lai, a beautiful ship that could carry 1,000 passengers in complete luxury. The ship had the newest engines, state-of-the-art interfaces, and gilded hallways. Each cabin had a pseudo-glass wall, and from the outside the effect was like a polished gem. Aptly, its name meant jeweled crown when translated into galactic standard. Wealthy Fe'en would book passage to tour what would inevitably be a new addition to the Republic, gawking both at the strange alien world and the Mashan servants that waited on them claw and wing. Hubris, again, was the crown's downfall. Eager to impress the powerful citizens on this ship, the captain exceeded the speed restrictions in the upper atmosphere of Masha and collided with a massive geopositioning satellite. Though much stronger than silicon-based glass, the beautiful walls of the ship were unable to withstand 10,000 kilograms of steel splintering into the side. Had the ship been slower, or had the satellite crashed into a different part of the jeweled crown, then the ship's advanced safety features would have mitigated the disaster. But the perfect storm of choice and chaos caused a chain reaction of failures that shattered the ship. Shards of the crown and its passengers rained down onto the beautiful planet of Masha. And now, the lie. Rather than admit that the situation had been a humiliating, costly mistake, the Republic decided that it was better to blame the Mashans. This, they announced, had been a deliberate act of sabotage by the panicky little herbivores. Destruction on a civilian vessel was an act of war. The slumbering beast that the Fe'en created was now out of its control. Faced with the opportunity, the Republic screamed for blood. Where were you when the jewel crown burned? Susan asked the voices. I was at the embassy, fielding hundreds of calls from citizens on the planet. I remember being furious. I wanted revenge with every fiber of every feather. Ra'ami's crest flattened, and she let out a low, slow whistle. I was so young then. I was in my office. I'm an astronomer, you see, and we were having trouble with our geopositioning software. That's when I learned that one of the key satellites was down because of a spaceship accident. A tragedy, of course, but none of us expected war to come from it, said Dr. Ipper softly. I was at a bar, probably, drawled Leslie. The FN were our neighbors, sure, but we weren't invested in this whole mess. I learned about the disaster a few days later, when the Republic declared war. They paused. I was probably at a bar then, too. The FN thought the war would last for 5 months at most. They were more technologically advanced, more numerous, and most importantly, they were carnivores, predators who historically fed on creatures like the soft-furred Martians. The importance of biological imperative was, and still is, weighed heavily, but every sapient species modulates their ingrained response. Susan clapped her hands, loud and sudden, and the audience snapped to attention in species-appropriate ways. The startle response, for one, said Susan dryly, but no one is running away or trying to attack me. I wonder why. This time, amusement rippled through the audience. So tell me, Susan raised her arms and did her best not to stare directly at her professor. Can we overcome our instincts? Yes, said the crowd as one. Trends are not absolutes. The complexity of sapient actions cannot be narrowed into timid herbivores and vicious carnivores. And yet, there are biological imperatives that are deeper, still deeper, than the surface-level generalizations that we pretend to determine the entirety of behavior. This sudden declaration of war shocked the Martian people out of their complacency. There's an expression in their language, to circle the herd. The implications from that phrase are complex, but two main ideas are conveyed. Everyone protects those who cannot fight, and everyone unites to fight with the last possible breath. The FN have spent eons as the hunter, but the Martians have spent equally as long as the hunted. The war would last for 34 years. When the opportunity came, her armies flew into the jaws of war, eager to serve with the best of her abilities. She was no warrior, but she flattered herself with the idea that her contributions were equally valuable. She, after all, was doing the tedious, vital task of bureaucracy. She helped manage the logistics of conquest, tracking supply lines, distributing food, evacuating the wounded, and the 100 other minor details that had to be managed outside the fog of war. Her rage against the Martians had been equal to any other warm-blooded FN, but Ra'ami soon quenched her thirst for war. Unfortunately, the war continued, and she continued as the efficient little cog that she was. Ra'ami made the mistake of being too efficient, too competent. She was soon directed to a position vital to the war effort that could only be filled by someone trustworthy and persuasive. Logistics for the main prisoner of war holding camp. The containment zone was a cesspool of misery. No one wanted to divert resources from the military to feed enemy prisoners, and the soldiers tasked to guard the prisoners were equally miserable. Ra'ami found herself having to fight for everything. Obedience from the soldiers, supplies from Central Command, permission from her superiors. To make things work, the Martians refused to negotiate for their captured brethren, and the Martian soldiers refused to speak a single word. Almost all of them seemed capable of slipping into a catatonic state at will, as if death had taken their minds, though considering the condition of the camps, physical death was not far behind. Ra'ami's crest flattened against her neck, and she said, I remember 2 soldiers standing over a catatonic body of a prisoner and wondering how his flesh would taste. Vocal disgust erupted from the audience. I tried to have them removed from the camp, but we already had trouble with retaining guards. No one took my complaints seriously. Her voice was full of disgust and loathing. I told myself so many lies about the moral necessity of that war. They all disappeared in that camp. Ra'ami spent 10 years at that post, beaten down by monotony and callous cruelty. Then her routine was shaken up by the arrival of a prisoner who was unlike any who had entered the camp before. He was old. Dr. Ipper had watched the war escalate from his position in the university. He still studied the stars, but the gears of war had subsumed the place of learning into his machinery. His colleagues worked on projects that tracked not the shadow of far-off asteroids, but the flight plan of enemy ships. As the conflict dragged on, and military rationing was enforced, More and more of his young students were sent to the front lines to fight. "How much potential must we have lost?" Dr. Ipper said, his eyes drooping. "The older I become, the more I expect loss to be my companion. But I should be losing my peers, not my protégés. How much we could have learned, how much we could have achieved. But the brightest of our younger generation has been lost to that damned war." As an elder who had no expertise in war, he nonetheless knew much more about its progress than he wanted to. True, he was involved in the effort to track enemy ships, but there was one other factor that kept him well informed. His daughter, who was the general of the Martian ground forces. "Like any father, I was overjoyed that my child's achievements had outstripped my own. I simply wish that she hadn't needed to suffer so much." Dr. Ipper was supposed to be safe, ensconced in the city stronghold. But after 30 years of war, self-imposed limits were being thrown aside. The FN bombarded the city from orbit. Dr. Ipper evacuated with the other civilians, but his daughter's position had ensured that he had the assistance of military escort. "They were good kids," he said quietly. He didn't continue for several moments. That same military escort drew unwanted attention from the FN ground forces, rushed in. The soldiers of both sides fought bravely, violently, but the FN were better prepared for this kind of battle. Much to his dismay, Dr. Ipper was taken prisoner. We must pause to acknowledge a basic truth. Lifespan varies across sapient species. Humans without medical intervention can live to 100, and with modern technology they can easily reach 160 in good health. FN lived for about 80 years without intervention, and 120 with it. Martians, though, routinely reach 400 without any intervention. "We are only capable of reproducing the first century of our lives," Dr. Ipper explained. "After the age of 30, we can have litters of approximately 6 children every 2 years. But our children are very, very fragile. Most die before the age of 30 due to genetic defects. And our children don't approach sapience until their first decade. It's quite normal for a bonded pair to produce around 90 children, with only 8 reaching adulthood. I have 4 adult children myself, but I had many more who never survived." "It is different for us," said Ra'ami. "We lay maybe 3 eggs in our lifetime, and if all 3 are viable, that's considered extremely lucky. I have 1 son, who I cherish deeply." "Humans are between the two," Susan said to the audience. "Theoretically, we could produce as many as 12 children, but most couples have no more than 3, if even that. I don't have any kids, and I don't plan to for a long time." The crowd chuckled more loudly than the joke warranted, seizing this light-hearted moment after so many grim anecdotes. These differences, as one might expect, changed the perspective of a culture has about life and death. The N degrade rapidly in the last years of our life. We call it the final molt. Once it starts, the process is irreversible. We don't really have anything like old age. We live, and then we die. Martians are considered young adults until our 1st century. Our 2nd century is true adulthood, when we are free from biological imperative to mate and reproduce. But after our 2nd century, we are elders. We are considered to hold expertise and wisdom vital to society. I don't feel very wise most days, Dr. Ipper says dryly. But now I have reached my 3rd century. I'm considered irreplaceable. Commander Leslie spoke last. "Humans hit what we call middle age at 60 and old age at around 100. It's a slow breakdown that sucks balls. But it used to be worse, yeah. You're supposed to be wise and shits. Sorry, I'm not supposed to say that. Once you hit 70. "And we knew none of this about the Martians," Ra'ami said, "because we didn't think it was important." Dr. Ipper sighed. "Neither did we. Both of our people were operating from ignorance. Though, considering that we were trying to conquer you, I think that's excusable. Ignorance is ignorance, even about an enemy, and especially about an enemy. Knowledge is inevitable." The Martians have another unique quirk of biology. In the distant past, their main predators only consumed live prey. Thus, the Martians eventually evolved the ability to play dead at will and enter a comatose state that could last for 10 hours. This was the same technique that they had been using in the POW camp to avoid torture. As bizarre as it was for the FN to witness, it kept the camps easy to manage. Granted, they gained very little information from their prisoners, but they were docile and easy to transport in their strange limp state. At least that had been the case until the strange old prisoner showed up. His escorts had fought with surprising desperation, so the troops had decided to keep him alive. When the prisoners saw the new prisoner in the camp, in the brief span between the comatose states, their entire attitude changed. No longer did they have an attitude of detached acceptance. The mood changed to furious, dangerous defiance. Though shocked by the attitude shift in their prisoners, the Feck guards responded tenfold. It was easier to bring violence on beings that were now reacting. There was no danger in the conflict spreading into human space. The war took place in a single system on the opposite edge of Feck territory. If anything, it was a benefit. Humanity didn't need to worry so much about the border when the Feck was so occupied with their petty war. The war had dragged on for 30 years without human interference, and it could drag on for another 30 for all the UHN cared. Considering they had a treaty of non-interference with their neighbors, the UHN was so unable to do anything, even if they wanted to. And yet, there was something about that war that felt odd. The United Human Nations didn't actually know much about what was going on. The little information they got was all from the Feck. An opportunity soon came to change their lack of knowledge. At the end of the 30th year of war, the UHN received a simple missive from a minor Feck government official by the name of L'Ol. Would they be interested in sending a small contingent of humans to be neutral observers? Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and Susan smiled. L'Ol was the current president of the Republic, and she was credited with negotiating the treaty that ended the Feck-Martian War. But a first conversation with the United Human Nations was much less known. L'Ol was a member of the quickly growing anti-war faction. Civilians, soldiers, and politicians alike were tired of the endless cycle of death that had already torn an entire generation apart. But could they just leave with nothing to show for all the blood lost? "That's when I showed up," Leslie said. They shrugged in a nonchalant way that made light ripple across their black armor. "Oh, we showed up, I guess. We were a small group of special forces and brainy specialists who were there to get as much information on the war as we could." Humanity was familiar with the wars of conquest, and the observing group knew exactly what they were walking into within days of their arrival. The difference between both sides was equally obvious. The Feck were tired, bitter, and approaching defeatism. They fought with the enthusiasm of forces away from home with no desire to fight. The Martians, however, had everything on the line. They fought because annihilation was the only other option. "I got the unlucky job of observing the POW camps. Fucking awful, yeah? Damn it. I keep forgetting I can't cuss. Really awful? Yeah. No, that's not strong enough. Can't think of a word that gets across just how much it sucked." "Horrendous, soul-crushing, disgusting," offered Ra'ami. Dr. Ipper joined in. "Heinous, reprehensible, monstrous." "Vicious," Susan said quietly, but not too quiet for the mics to pick up. "I don't need vocabulary lesson," Leslie scoffed. They mused over the words for a moment. "Fucking awful," they repeated. Leslie had spent years specializing in violence. After spending so long entrenched in its use, they had developed a feeling for its survival, like a farmer judging the likelihood of a storm. The POW camp was brewing with potential bloodshed. Any moment, they expected a downpour. "Metaphorically," Dr. Ipper piped up, "the atmosphere of Masha isn't conducive to landstorms. Instead, most of our agriculture is based around periodic flooding." "Not the point, old man," Leslie interrupted, a grin on their face. The potential violence seemed centered around the strange little Martian. Now, Leslie was no expert in telling the age of Martians. They hadn't even met a Martian prior to their deployment. But this one seemed old, with patchy grey fur, somewhat like a senior-aged cat. All the other prisoners seemed deeply protective of him, and the guards had picked up on that. Threats against the old Martian seemed more effective than personal threats. The guards were using it to make the prisoners behave, but that wouldn't last. Leslie could already see the rebellion simmering. Leslie had asked the Feck why the old Martian was so special. The Feck weren't sure. The Martians wouldn't speak to them, of course, and half of them didn't know Galactic Standard anyway. "And then this trembling, gawky-looking Feck came up to me and asked me to find out," said Leslie, the laughter clear in their voice. Ra'ami knew that no prisoner would trust her. The new human, on the other hand, was an unknown. If anyone had a chance of negotiating, it was them. Sure, it irked that Ra'ami, who was so proud of her silver tongue, had to sit back and let someone else do it, and this alien wasn't exactly, tactful. But the human agreed to talk to the prisoners, and though they were initially wary, the Martians jumped at the chance of making possible allies, and more importantly, getting their honored elder to safety. Almost everyone that Leslie talked to had begged them to save Elder Ipper, and not themselves. "I wasn't the only one who was unhappy," Ra'ami made a quiet little troll, "but none of us paper pushers were brave enough to talk to each other about it. The consequences of treason during wartime was harsh, and at the time, no one trusted anyone. Then the strange human showed up. Suddenly, we had an outsider, and that was enough for us to see our own situation differently, to try and see it with their eyes. "What did you see?" Susan asked. A prisoner had mouthed off to a guard, and the guard had taken violent offense to that, and they'd hit Ippa hard enough to make him crumple. The prisoner immediately attacked. The guard, who was wearing power armor, beat the prisoner to death in self-defense. I tried to carry the injured Mashin to the infirmary, but it was too late. His blood had drenched my wings, and it was the same bright green as my feathers. I never knew his name. Ra'ami flared her wings, angled to keep their emerald green hue. I saw a war that had dragged on for so long that we'd lost ourselves in it, and I was tired of being complicit. Life in a POW camp was monotonous and painful in ways beyond the physical. Granted, the physical labor and beatings weren't pleasant, but Dr. Ippa found it significantly harder to see people get injured because of him. If the roles were switched, he would have done the same, but the roles weren't switched, and he could do nothing to help. After a month, the excruciating humdrum of prison was abruptly broken. A new alien called a human had arrived. At first, they had followed the Feck around, and the prevailing fear had been that mercenaries were entering the war front. Then the humans started talking to them, and they learned that the human was an observer from a neutral entity. The human, who was named Leslie, was a strange person. They were undeniably a soldier, and their way of speaking was rough and blunt. But when they looked at each prisoner, it felt like they truly considered each Mashin to be a person. Perhaps that was why Ippa was willing to trust Leslie when they showed up with an arrogant-looking Feck bureaucrat. Ra'ami looked me in the eye and declared, "We're going to rescue you," said Dr. Ippa. "I could believe that a human would want to help, but a Feck, why in the world would they want to do that?" "I could have handled that better," Ra'ami admitted. Leslie snorted. "I was trying not to laugh." Ippa had just watched a young Mashin bleed out to protect him. He had had enough. If going along with the human and the Feck would get him out of this prison and keep those young ones alive, he was willing to try. So Ippa just blinked and replied, "All right. How are we doing that?" "I was so shocked that he was willing to listen," Ra'ami said. "Honestly, I hadn't thought too far ahead." "Well, they had me there to think for them," said Leslie. As a foreign observer of a powerful neutral nation, Leslie was given a significant amount of leeway in the camp. They promptly abused their power to claim diplomatic business and waltzed out of the camp with Ra'ami as their escort and Ippa in a duffel bag. Leslie shrugged. "Standard human exfil tactics. It's amazing what you can get away with if you act confident." Then they contacted the leader of the human mission, asking for directions to the nearest Mashin contingent. The commander beamed out Leslie to the Galactic Core and back, and then she gave them the approximate coordinates with a couple of additional expletives. At this point, Leslie made eye contact with Musa and winked. "I knew I'd be disciplined and sent off planet, but it was definitely worth it." The Mashin armed forces in this area of the war front didn't have stationary bases. They never stayed in one place for long, harassing Feck forces and then disappearing into the cities and forests of the planet. With their ground vehicle, Leslie, Ra'ami, and Ippa would catch up with them in 3 days. Dr. Ippa almost sounded nostalgic as he spoke. "The three of us spent the 3 days talking. There isn't much else to do on a trip like that. We shared our life stories, our dreams, our fears. Nothing was off limits." Ra'ami made a whistle of agreement. "I learned more about Mashins and human culture in those 3 days than I had in the entire 30 years prior." "I mostly tried to stay awake while they blathered," said Leslie, "and I did the actual work of navigating, driving, scaring off wild creatures, setting up camp." "I'd take offense if it wasn't true," Ra'ami said cheerfully. "We would have starved without you."
"Yeah, because I was the only one who packed food. Thankfully, the UHN sent me a huge pack of vegan and jerky rations, so I was able to feed both of them."
"After a month of prisoner food, that tasted delicious. I still eat them from time to time," said Dr. Ippa. Ra'ami trilled. "They were disgusting."
"Yeah, they're pretty shit."
They didn't find the Mashin forces, but the Mashin forces found them. They were following a broken road through the forest when between one blink and the next they were surrounded. Dr. Ippa hadn't noticed a thing, and neither had Ra'ami, judging by the way she'd screamed. Leslie, though, hadn't reacted at all. All their guns were pointed at Ra'ami, and Dr. Ippa didn't hesitate to shove her behind him. "Don't shoot her," he shouted in their native tongue. "She saved me." The Mashins didn't lower their guns, but they didn't look like they were about to immediately shoot.
"We come in peace,"
Leslie said in Galactic Standard. The gun swiveled to him. "Quiet, alien," said the soldier. "Let the elder speak." All of her life, Ra'ami had relied on power of her words. Now her life was on the line,
and she couldn't say a single sentence. She couldn't understand a single sentence. It all rested on the shoulders of Ippa. Her people had ravaged his home, kept him prisoner, and killed countless of his brethren. If he changed his mind, Ra'ami wouldn't blame him. Her crest was standing straight up with fear, and the desperate staccato tone of the argument didn't help with her anxiety. Only Leslie's calm demeanor kept her from trying to take flight. Ippa was repeating a sound over and over again. Now he put his hand on her wing and said it again. "What was that word?" Susan asked. "The word was Aksha," said Ra'ami. "Mercy." "Why should we give her mercy?" asked the soldier in standard. "If she let her go, then she could give the Fe'en information about us." "I wouldn't," Ra'ami said immediately. The soldier finally looked at her. "Your people have ways to make their enemies talk," she replied. Harsh. "How well can you withstand torture? How do we know this isn't a trap? Perhaps you implanted a tracker under the other's skin, or maybe even a bomb." Ippa shook his head. "Then kill me instead. If you are so scared, then remove this doubt." The soldier flinched at the thought. The conversation switched back into the other language, rapid fire. The soldier became more and more frustrated until she finally threw her hands in the air. "Very well," she exclaimed, exasperated, switching back once again. "We will do that. I hope your wisdom stays true, Elder, because any bloodshed from this is on your hands." The guns were finally lowered, and Dr. Ippa turned to Ra'ami and Leslie. "It has been decided. They will give me an escort to the closest city," he said, "and they will let you both go." Dr. Ippa tilted his head low, exposing the back of his neck, and judging by the reactions of the soldiers around them, the gesture meant a great deal. "I promise I'll repay you both." "There's nothing to repay," said Ra'ami. "I'm only doing what I should have done." In lieu of saying anything, Leslie just nodded. "Then I will promise we'll meet again," Dr. Ippa said firmly, "and I'll probably show you my gratitude." Her crest flattened. "You can't promise that." Ra'ami knew that she would be court-martialed and thrown into some dark, dark hole if she was lucky. She might not be meeting anyone again. Ippa tapped her on the shoulder. "Young one, don't tell me what I can and cannot promise." "You heard him," said Leslie. "We'll definitely all meet again." Despite all logic, Ra'ami believed them. Once the old mansion was safe and the military had departed, Leslie was planning on heading back to the small UHN encampment with Ra'ami. Sending her back was a horrible idea by every measure, and yet the foolish Fe'en insisted on going back. "It's the right thing to do," she said. "I know it probably won't end well, but I'm tired of running. If I can convince one other person that they don't have to go along with the war, then that'll be enough for me. Just do me one small favor. Don't forget me." Leslie gave her the promise. "I spent 4 years in prison. It was in significantly better conditions than what I witnessed in the war. For some crazy reason, these two fools insisted on keeping in touch with me." "She asked me to bear witness," said Leslie. "I don't know why she expected anything else. If I made a few veiled threats to ensure her safety, then that's my business." Dr. Ippa made a small huff of amusement. "How were we supposed to meet again if we never talked?" "I admit, without their letters, prison would have been much harder to bear." Ra'ami shook her head and continued. "After 3 years, the anti-war faction won the elections in a landslide. I won't lie and say that my people didn't want blood," said Dr. Ippa. "They did. The younger ones had never known a life in peacetime, and the older ones remembered all too well what they had lost. But this was victory. The Fe'en wanted to conquer us, but they could not. We made them sue for ceasefire. I stood next to my daughter as she worked out the terms of the agreement. Independence, and finally, peace. On my part, I strongly encouraged the creation of cultural exchanges so that our people would understand each other. That may have included mercy for Fe'en dissidents, specifically the one who saved my life." Leslie grunted. "I was there too, but mostly just stood there. My commander threatened to dishonorably discharge me if I pulled any shit. Most of us humans just stood there, honestly. The Fe'en and Mashin had a lot of bad blood between them, and the UHN was there for peace of mind, really." "I wasn't there," Ra'ami's crest flared. "But once the peace treaty was signed, I and the other anti-war dissidents were pardoned and released from our cells. I spent a few months catching up with what I had missed, and then I left to the United Human Nations to fulfill a promise. I joined Ra'ami not long after. Yes, I had to convince my children and grandchildren, but eventually they let me work as a visiting professor and meet my friends on the planet Earth."
"I had 2 beers waiting for them with their names on it," Leslie said, grinning. The 3 friends did indeed meet again, and again, and again, and again. Dr. Ippa traveled back and forth between Masha and Earth. He found that he liked teaching students on Earth just as much as he liked teaching students of his own planet.
Though Leslie was still deployed throughout the galaxy, they were always happy to meet their friends for a drink. "And I adopted Earth as my new home," said Ra'ami quietly. She didn't elaborate, and Susan didn't ask. By the end of the war, there were soldiers born in wartime who had never lived through a year of peace. Now, there are fully fledged adults born in peacetime who have never lived through a year of war. This is how the war ends. The stage lights dimmed, signaling the shift into the last part of the epic. Ra'ami, Dr. Ippa, and Leslie moved from their respective places and lined up in front of her, their backs to the audience, in effect joining it. A trickle of sweat dripped down Susan's back. Her voice felt scratchy in her throat, but she was determined to see it through to the end. Susan raised her arms high. "We end with the beginning, and we finish where we end," she shouted. The audience echoed her as one. They were all standing, as was customary. Susan wanted to see her friends' reactions, but the spotlight had shifted onto her, and the glare was too bright to make them out. She could see her three voices, though. Dr. Ippa's ears flicked, a proud gesture, and Ra'ami gave her an approving nod. Susan made eye contact with Leslie, and after a moment, they smiled. She let the silence settle for another moment. "What story do we tell?" "We tell the story of Ra'ami. We tell the story of Ippa. We tell the story of Leslie," said the crowd. Her arms were beginning to shake. She kept them raised. "Who listens here?" "We listen here, speaker." "Who speaks here?" As one, the three voices and the entirety of the audience spoke. "We speak here." She lowered her arms. "And so we have spoken." The minutes after her performance felt like a haze. She barely registered the applause or the closing speeches, too lightheaded from putting off the feat. Commander Leslie helped her off stage. Dr. Ippa tapped her on her shoulder, and Ra'ami handed her a water bottle and whispered, "Wonderful job." Adding to the dreamlike effect, all four of them were swarmed the second the event was over. Susan shook hands, wings, fin tentacles, and claws. She learned dozens of names and promptly forgot them. The dean, the department head, and even the Mashan ambassador congratulated her. Musa actually smiled, and that was scarier than anything she'd done before. The attention was nice, exhilarating even, but what Susan wanted to do was take a nice, long nap. "I heard about why you did this," said a nondescript human that Susan had never seen before. He pressed an ident card into her hand, and her personal device pinged as it registered. "That was excellent work. Musa was right to recommend you highly. I suggest you contact me after you graduate." He left without waiting for a response. The mysterious person stopped briefly to say something to Leslie and Musa before walking out the door entirely. Yeah, Susan would deal with that some other time, when she wasn't at risk of passing out. She slowly sat down in an empty chair and scanned the remaining crowd. Gorp was still talking to his journalism buddies, while Omi and a few other Mashans were talking to Dr. Ippa. Susan closed her eyes for a second, enjoying the brief respite. "Susan Patel!" She almost jumped out of her skin. Professor Kaife was standing in front of her, practically looming. "Professor, you scared me." He didn't apologize. In fact, he didn't say anything. Kaife simply continued to stare at her with a strange look in his beady eyes. Professor, did you need something?" Susan kept her voice polite, desperately trying to not gloat at the moment. "How did I do?" "Your project was a little melodramatic," said Kaife. "You three voices did most of the work. I'm not sure how much credit you deserve." "What are you talking about?" she snapped. Her pleased smugness dissipating immediately. After an intensive crash course on all call-and-response epics, she knew that Kaife was full of shit. The speaker definitely has the hardest part. You have to weave the narrative, construct the back and forth with the audience and the voices, keep the improvisation from derailing the performance. "You're being loud again, Susan Patel," he interrupted, "and I know. You did well." "What?" she responded, confused. His crest flared, and he let out a low, reluctant whistle. "I said that you did well. That was remarkable." Susan finally identified the emotion in his eyes. Respect. Grudging, reluctant respect, but respect. Oh, thanks. She didn't need his praise or approval. That had never been her intention in doing this. But since she apparently had gotten it, "Professor, did I change your mind at all?" "That entire performance was all anecdotal, Susan Patel. Why would it change my mind?" She tried not to glare. "Oral history is still history, as you like to remind us, Professor." Kaife let out another low whistle. "I'm not convinced that your amateur performance counts as such." Then, sounding as if his feathers were being plucked out one by one, he added, "Though perhaps I could include one or two Mashan perspectives in the next year's course. Do you have any recommendations?" "Don't ask me, ask a Mashan. Weren't you listening at all?" With that, she walked away, leaving behind her shocked, sputtering professor. Susan spotted Obi and Gorp standing together as she hurried to join them. She waved off their congratulations, and with a bright grin, she slung her arms around their shoulders. "Hey, are you two hungry? Because I'm starving." End of story. I'd greatly like to thank our Tier 5 channel members, Casper Arnholt, John Creighton, Manatharia, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.